Things Policy, a daily podcast supported by Pragati, a flagship media initiative of the Takshashila Institution. We're a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like to bring a fresh perspective to Indian affairs and an Indian perspective to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello everyone, welcome to one more episode of All Things Policy. I'm Sarthak, and along with me I have my colleague Suman, and today we are going to discuss the debate of freebies or debate around freebies. And yeah, I'm not very sure whether I should be using this term because again, there are different viewpoints when it comes to the word freebie. But yeah, we'll come to that in a while. So hi Suman, welcome to All Things Policy.
Hi Sarthak, great to be back.
So before we start the discussion, what is the context? Why are we discussing this?
Okay, there's been a lot of talk over this, and I think the Supreme Court is also hearing a lot of arguments on this. But the root cause or the root of this issue goes back to the Sri Lankan crisis, economic crisis. In the wake of the Sri Lankan economic crisis, the Reserve Bank of India actually conducted a fiscal vulnerability or fiscal feasibility study of the states. Okay, because the RBI keeps a tab on the economic conditions of the states as well. And it found that in states like Punjab and Andhra Pradesh, the freebies, as we call them, exceeded 2% of the gross state domestic product. Yeah. And so that is a cause for concern if your deficit exceeds certain percentage. And so the RBI actually flagged it for discussion. Now, in this particular context, the freebies that we are referring to are power subsidies. Punjab actually gives out huge chunk of its expenditure is power subsidies, gives free power to everybody. And since it is heavily, agriculture is dependent on this kind of free electricity or free power, it has led to certain problems within the state finances itself. So, and what has happened is because every state is giving these kind of benefits, freebies or what we call them, it has led to them resorting to off-the-budget financing in the sense that they are not showing their borrowings in their state budgets. They're doing it off the budget. And that is not giving a clear picture of the state finances to anyone. And that becomes a cause for concern for the union government because eventually macroeconomic stability of the country is the responsibility of the union government.
So, Suman, before we move to that, right, this entire term, freebie, right? So in this particular context, you were referring to the subsidies, the power subsidies, right? But the term freebie is also used for other scenarios as well, right? For example, many political parties in their election manifesto will be promising host of things from bicycles to laptops, even saris, cooking gas, right? So all these things are also referred to as freebies. Apart from that, in the last 2 years, right, we have been through the pandemic, the different kind of tax reliefs and other measures that were provided by the government, right? And in some cases, it was also the cash transfers, right? So they are also referred to as freebies, right? So is there any way by which we can define what is a freebie? Is there any definition to that? What all goods and services will classify or it can be categorized as a freebie?
I don't think we have come up with a good definition for freebie because the state as an obligation to its citizens provides first thing it supposed to provide is the rule of law. And along with that is a lot of other welfare measures, as we call them. So there is welfare measures, there is the provision of merit goods, and there are also some compensatory things that the state provides. Now, which one is a freebie, which one state should provide, which one the state should not provide, is all determined by how much of tax revenue that any government can actually generate. Now, in the Western or in the advanced
tax revenue, overall revenue, right? So it need not.
Yeah, basically how much you can generate revenues. In the advanced countries, we look at them because they provide a lot of maybe health services, maybe, every other kind of education or, those kind of merit goods. And we expect the state to provide that for us. But everything again is determined by finances that we have.
So yeah, there's an interesting one because, you don't, some of these things that we are discussing, right? Maybe how do you classify, as them as freebie? Maybe they're all welfare programs and again, providing for welfare might not necessarily be wrong. Also, as you were pointing out, there are certain things which the markets most likely will not be providing, or they will not have the incentives to provide, things like public goods, right? So that is something which the government has to provide. But apart from that, governments typically provide goods which are basically meritorious in nature, the merit goods, right? So these things are most likely going to be underprovided by the market. So governments pitch in things like education, healthcare, infrastructure. They can be all merit goods. So it makes sense. And the point that you were mentioning, many of these advanced economies, if you look at some of these advanced economies, there the government spending is quite large, right? Wagner's law tells you that. So usually the advanced economies, even if they are so-called capitalistic economies, they will have a large government spending and they will be providing all these services. This entire term freebie itself seems kind of paternalistic, so as to say.
Yeah, and it is, we seem to use the term freebies only when we are referring to something that is given to the poorer people. Okay, it is used in a very pejorative, in a way that is, demeaning to poorer classes. So firstly, that definition of the word needs to, we need to think about it before we use that word. And yeah, there are other ways that we can, actually look at the whole issue. The issue is real of finances and what limited resources, unlimited needs.
And how do you ensure that you get the best out of whatever resources that you have?
Yeah. So the prioritization, all of that are real issues. We have to think about it in that way and not so much in a way that puts one set of people down or the other. Yeah. So at this point,
Also, one more thing. It's not that only the states provide for some of these things, right? The union government might also be providing for some of these things, right? For example, many of these things during the pandemic, cash benefits and other things.
Or
the union
Ujjwala.
government was, Ujjwala scheme where you are providing for cooking gas facilities. Right? They are all being provided by the union government, right? So who is providing for it? At what time it is being provided? Again, might lead to a situation where you're classifying something as freebie and something as a welfare program. So the point here is we do not have any uniform
definition
to categorize something as a freebie and something as a welfare program. So now, coming to the next part, what are the implications of some of these goods and services that are provided by the states or the union government?
When we say implications, we have to look at it as to what it does towards the public good. For example, if you look at the midday meal scheme, when it was brought into force by the Tamil Nadu government at that point, most people wrote it off and says that, it's not going to work also. But we saw that the provision of that midday meal scheme actually led to better school enrollment, led to better educational outcomes for the state of Tamil Nadu. Now, the midday meal scheme is not a public good in the strictest economic sense, because it's not a non-driverless good, nor is it a non-excludable good. Yeah. So we have to look at what the particular offering is doing. Again, that definition of, is that a freebie, is that not, is a very difficult one. And I think it is best decided between the political parties and the voters who they go to. Okay? It is a contract between them. So when a political party actually, puts forth in its manifesto that these are the things that we are going to provide, it is up to the voters to decide whether they want, or that's what the voters do. When we say that, you set up something and somebody outside is going to decide what is a good freebie and what is not a good freebie, I think we are insulting the intelligence of the voters, and we are, undermining the democratic process in that setting up of something, outside of the thing. So in my view, that is not the right way to go. It undermines democracy in a lot of ways.
Yeah. So, but one thing I want to point out here is whenever the politicians, right, they are canvassing for votes, they might promise these things. But typically they will talk about, okay, what we're going to provide. They're not going to talk about what is going to be the cost of that. How are we going to raise revenues for that, right? How is the financing going to happen? They don't mention, they might not be mentioning that. Usually that is what happens. And again, the voters might not be knowing, as they don't have the information, right? They might not be knowing about these things. And the repercussions of that they might face later on. Also, it's not just these voters, specifically when it comes to the state elections, right? Maybe because of some of these benefits which are given, maybe people who are not part of the same state, like they're somewhere else, they might also get impacted by it, right? Because again, if the state finances are impacted, maybe other places also get impacted, other neighboring states get impacted, the union gets impacted. So, I mean, I would assume that you should also do a cost benefit kind of analysis, or at least the political parties should make it kind of open. How are they should mention, right, how they're going to finance some of these things.
So I think where we have to, I mean, the issue can be seen through a strict economic sense in terms of public goods, private goods, externalities, etc. But there is no policy. There is no policy without politics. So we have to bring in the politics part of it. And since this is in the public space, we cannot have a discussion just purely from an economic standpoint. So at this point, I'd like to tell all our listeners about our courses. If you want to learn more about the economics, politics, and everything around, and the communication around public policy, do consider applying for the Graduate Certificate in Public Policy course. Our next cohort begins September 3rd. The last date for application is 27th August. You can choose from 3 specializations: the Advanced Public Policy, the Tech and Policy, and the Defense and Foreign Affairs. So, if this interests you, do go to our website, school.tachshila.org.in, and apply for this course. We'll come back after the break. Welcome back after the break. We are discussing the much talked about freebies issue. We are discussing what freebies are, who should decide, and
Public choice theory as well.
yes, public choice theory. And at this point, we are discussing some of the implications of the fee. Okay? So, Sarthak, so what could be some other repercussions of indiscriminate?
Yeah. So one is, as you are pointing out, that there are some positive implications, right? For example, if you're spending on health or education, RD and other midday meal, etc. But also sometimes, like if you're spending money on certain kinds of goods and services, that also implies you're not able to spend money on other kinds of goods and services. So there is an opportunity cost to that.
And those probably are the goods and services that only the government can provide for, and not the market.
Yeah. And maybe that is something which is even more important, right? You don't know that. And maybe there are public goods, maybe you're not spending enough on the merit goods. So there is definitely an opportunity cost. Apart from that, we need to have these questions from time to time, right? What are the things that the government should be spending its resources on? Because governments typically will always be constrained, right? In terms of revenue, or in terms of monetary resources, in terms of other resources as well, right? Capacity as well. Maybe they do not have enough manpower and all these things, right? So if you are having your manpower for something else, if you are diverting your resources for some human resources for something else, again, you have to think about it. Also, if you are having a high deficit, right? It's going to be impacting your future generations, high deficit, high debts. So it is going to be a tax on your future generations, right? You cannot just go on spending like that. The next generations will get impacted. And again, if there's a lot of borrowing, it somehow crowds out there will be a crowding out effect as well. So other states might get impacted, the union might get impacted. So all these are the different kinds of implications that can be there if you are not having some thought through spending, I guess.
Yeah, but thought through spending is again defined
exactly
by politicians as their contract with, as their negotiation with their voter, right? So
I know we are going to. So right now, these things are being discussed at the level of the judiciary. And should the judiciary be deciding it, or should the union government be deciding it?
Yeah. So I don't think it is for the judiciary or for the union government to decide it as a matter of policy. Judiciary cannot decide it because it's policy matter. Policy is always decided outside of
the legislature.
The legislature. If the government has to decide it, then it has to be through a consensus with, different states, whatever. But you have to build an institution, or you have to build a separate body that will decide.
So here also, I think there are multiple levels. See, when it comes to macroeconomic stability, right? So here again, the union government is more responsible, right? So if you are looking at this question from another angle, right? Let's say it's the question of fiscal mismanagement rather than what you should be giving out to what you should be giving out to the people. That is something where the union government has a role to play. But states, I think, should have a larger role to play when it comes to, they should have the liberty to decide what they should do with their own finances. If they're able to generate enough revenue to provide for public goods, for merit goods, and for private goods, it's okay if they have a revenue for that. But if they're not having a revenue.
Yeah, but again, their revenue comes from their share of revenue. In the new GST, they keep.
That is there, but they also have things which are within their own control, right? So they can generate different kinds of tax revenue. They have capacity to generate some own tax revenues. They also have the capacity to provide for private goods and charge for that, right? User charges they can. Many states don't do that, right? So the thing is, when it comes to macroeconomic stability and all, maybe the union government has a role to play if you look at it from the lens of that, right? Fiscal mismanagement. But when it comes to deciding what goods to be provided, I don't think it's the union government's or the judiciary.
Yes, that I agree. So can actually the union government or can we withhold revenue for the states? The revenue deficit grants that you're giving, can they be withheld for fiscal mismanagement? Or can you link it to freebies or, off-budget liabilities? Like if you say that if you're not curbing your off-budget liabilities, I will not give you.
I would rather say we should try to have a long-term solution to this, right? Instead of these can be a patchwork kind of a solution. We should look at it in a longer time horizon, maybe at both the levels, union governments, at the state level also. You should have bodies which reflect on what things the government is spending money on, what goods and services they're providing, what are the intended outcomes. You should clearly define what is the objective of any policy, what is the likely output, right? The quantitative thing that you are going to achieve. What is going to be the outcome of that, right? If you are distributing bicycles, right? What is the aim of that, right? How many girls will be able to go to colleges? What is going to be the outcome of that, right? For example, what will be the level of social mobility for these families or for these girls? So these things you can possibly define beforehand, and you can consistently, measure these things, measure these outcomes. So that will justify the spending on these different kinds of resources. And again, it should not be the case that you have one body at the union level and it is deciding for all the state. The state should also have. Generally these bodies are there in some other governments, other countries. They're called fiscal councils, and they should have their own independent exist. They should have their own powers. They should have their own mandate. They should not be under certain government, right? Or else they will not be able to hold the governments accountable. So maybe if you have some of these institutions, then maybe we'll have solutions to this, right? Maybe some of these welfare programs are actually beneficial, right? At the end of the day, you are doing a cost-benefit analysis, right? The benefit should outweigh the cost. And also, whenever any political party is making any announcement during the time of the elections, they need to ensure that they have to mention how are they going to finance all these things, what will be the trade-offs, what are the things that they possibly won't be able to do. Usually what happens in public policy, you have what is called as opportunity cost neglect. So as an individual, when I am taking a decision, I will look at all the different scenarios, right? If I'm going for option A, then I will also think about, okay, what will happen in case I would have gone for option B or option C. But when it comes to public policy, when it comes to politics, usually people don't think about that. They only talk about the option and those who are providing for it or those who are likely going to provide for it, the politicians, they will only market about that. They will not talk about that.
Yeah.
So maybe we should have more debate discussions on that also.
Yeah. As citizens, I think we should be looking at it more carefully when any of this is, spoken about.
Yeah. And at the end of the day, states should also try to ensure that their revenue position is better.
Yeah,
right?
I think that is the cause.
Yes. They should find out ways by which they can increase their tax base. I'm not saying increase the tax rates, because again, there is a linkage between that. Try to find out ways by which you are able to increase your total revenue, maybe widen the tax base, maybe reduce the tax rates also in some cases. Find out innovative ways in some sectors which can be taxed. If you are providing for some private goods, again, ideally the government should not be providing for that. If you are providing for it, ensure that user charges are levied on all these things. And if the states are revenue, they are having decent amount of revenue, then all these questions will not even be raised.
Yes. Yeah. So at the end of this discussion, what we have come to is that firstly, we should not be using the term freebies in the sense of
in a very general manner,
in a very general and a very pejorative way. Second, it is a matter of concern that our finances are in a dire situation, most state finances, and we need to take a relook at this. But how this is done, who decides, and what form it should take is up for debate. We certainly feel that policy matters should stay outside the realm of, a Supreme Court decided, body or they should not even be hearing this actually. But yeah, so that is the crux of it. But the key takeaway is that let's be aware that, every provision of any kind of good comes at a cost. And those costs, as citizens, we should be keenly observing and, make our informed decisions about what we want. Is that a good conclusion, Sarthak?
Yes, I think so. Covered most of the points. Yeah. Thanks, Suman. Thanks to our audience for tuning in. We'll meet again in one more episode of All Things Policy.
Thank you. Thank you.
If you liked our show, don't forget to check out other interesting podcasts on the IVM network. You can tune into them on the IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or wherever you listen to your podcasts. You can also follow IVM on social media. The handle is @IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And hey, if you'd like to dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs, check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.